This evening, which is about Emmy Bridgwater. Thank you so much for coming out on a rainy London evening. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Dr. Rüll. I work at the University of Nottingham, and way back in the day as a mature student, I did my undergraduate dissertation, this behemoth, on Emmy Bridgwater. So I'm the one that's probably, in terms of researching about her, got the most history. Tor is working currently on research around Edith Rimington, who was a good friend of Emmy Bridgwater's, and we're really privileged to have Lucy Orta here, artist and writer, who is connected with the Bridgwater family. So there is a connection, we have familial connections here. So thank you for coming. I hope that you've had a chance to have a little bit of a look around the exhibition space. But for those of you who may be a bit less familiar with Emmy's work, let's give you a little bit of a potted history. So Emmy was born in 1906 in Birmingham, and she comes to the big exhibition in London in 1936, which is the catalyst for lots of people in the British Isles to actually really get to know Surrealist artworks and Surrealist artists. It is the spur for her getting to meet people like Edith and make those friendships. It is the spur for her to become involved with people in Birmingham, which is one of the things that really interested me about her work. And it is the spur for an artist's creativity that becomes really important as an example of Surrealist creativity in the UK. And she is still, unfortunately, less well known than we would like, and the fact that kind of nearly 30 years on from me having done my undergraduate work, which was by no means the first stuff to have been written about her, the fact that we are still having to kind of rediscover her is frustrating, but I think this exhibition is a fantastic kind of creative burst to kind of be able to see so many of her works in context. So after 1936, she becomes quite actively involved in painting and automatic drawing. We've got lots of examples of those here. Automaticity is where you start from a spark of a blur, a dot, a splot, and you create out of that using the subconscious. But she always seems to end up reaching into her own personal symbolism, and we'll come on to talk more about that as we go through. Subsequent to her being involved in being a really central part of the work that's happening in Birmingham, she is subsequently invited over to Paris for the 1947 exhibition by Breton, and she is praised and highlighted as a key contributor from the British Surrealist art scene. By the 1950s, she has only a limited period of time where she's actually very creatively active and in and out of London. There's only a couple of years where she's actually living in London. She has to go back as the unmarried middle daughter. She goes back to Birmingham to take care of her elderly mother and her disabled eldest sister. And that limits the creativity that she's able to pursue during those years in the 50s and 60s. Not completely, there are examples here, but it limits what she's able to do. And it is only in the kind of sort of late 60s, 70s when she starts exploring much more into collage, and we've got some fabulous examples of her work here. I'm so thrilled that the Land of Birds is going to be owned by somebody. That's just so fantastic for me. And I was lucky enough to meet her in 1993 when I was doing my undergraduate research. And a lot of the other surrealists who were still at the tail end of their lives at the period from Birmingham. So that's a little bit about my sort of involvement, a little bit of an overview of some of the work that Emmy is involved in. And what I'd like to do now is kind of start us off to think a little bit more deeply about the symbolism that she is using, the extent to which is it female symbolism or a symbolism that is much more drawn from her experience as a female artist. So one of the things that I'd like to pick up is the very obvious example of birds, which is almost everywhere in some way, shape or form throughout this exhibition. I know we were talking, was it last night or the night before? Time is a weird thing. And we were talking about kind of the violence and the imagery of using birds as part of her kind of symbolism. Did you want to kind of comment perhaps on a couple of the images that you were particularly taken with?
Well, I think when we talked about it, we were both like, which pictures do you want to talk about? And we went for the same ones because some of them just have such an impact. So footprints is one of the ones that I think people are most drawn to. And I think it looks way better in person. I don't think the photos do it justice anytime. But the way that I was looking at it was, well, we were talking about how women quite often get sort of put in with sort of the bird in the cage imagery, or if you've got Snow White, you've got the crone with the old crow, and for Bridgwater, the birds sort of symbolise violence and the violence of war, and we were talking about that and how they sort of stand in for the sort of threat of bombs in the sky and all that things, and they just appear again and again and again. Even in her automatic drawings. It's
a sense in which kind of the line inevitably seems to end up becoming bird-like. And if you think of kind of the way in which bird symbolism has often been kind of talked about, it tends to be much more around the bird as the idea of a representation of the soul or the inner being. But Bridgwater's birds are much more violent than that. They're much more spiky than that. They are on the attack a lot of the time. There's a sense in which, I think I made a note of a line sort of when I was re-looking at stuff, that sense in which it becomes something that is a violent explosion of kind of a soul in conflict. So there's much less kind of easiness. So even when she's kind of representing birds that might be deemed to be a little bit more sort of the imagination in flight, so things like phoenix and the peacocks that appear in a number of her works, it's much more of a sense of the soul being conflicted. So it is not clear-cut that you've got a straightforward equation of the bird and the soul and a personal kind of sort of representation of the self. And I think that's why footprints is one of the images that is so interesting, because you've got this sense of her self being under attack from the bird, which is her. And in the context of her life and her experiences and coming out of the war at this point, because it's around 1945, there's a sense in which she lives through all that violence of the Second World War, and certainly kind of her poetry, her writings have much more explicit kind of violence around the war experience within them. But it is interesting to kind of get this sense of conflict within the self. And I'm not sure how much the kind of sort of representation of birds in other women's surrealist artists necessarily do quite the same thing. I know with your work on Remington that her birds also have quite an edge to them, but it is much more a case of there's an element of pretty at the surface. I don't think there's any pretty at the surface with any of Bridgwater's birds. Do you want to?
Well, Remington just reworks her work, and when we were given a big chunk of things from one of her relatives' house, one of the big things that I noticed was this sort of old tattered piece of tracing paper, and there's also been works by Remington where there's tracing paper on the back, and she often traces things and reworks them over and over again, and makes them really perfect, and you can see that perfectionism in her work that Bridgwater doesn't have. So even with this one, it almost looks like the bird on the top of the head was slightly further down. So there's like the 3 little toes on the middle of the forehead, and it looks like maybe she had considered putting the bird further down, and then decided to move it back up and sort of left this sort of scratch mark.
Yeah.
But her work does have that unfinished feel that Remington's doesn't have, and I think that's really nice. When I was reading your thesis as well, you were talking about her interest in expressionism as well,
yes.
And that sort of feeds through in that sort of unfinished sort of painterly quality.
Yeah, there's definitely a greater painterly quality, and I'd be interested to know from Lucy, as a perspective of an artist, kind of thinking about creativity, how you see the kind of personal symbolism, kind of the expressionistic kind of elements of her work. Is that something that's kind of something that you kind of spot or kind of think is more complicated than that?
Well, I'm drawn to the automatic drawings.
Yes.
Drawing is a starting point for my practice, but I'm just absolutely blown by the marks that have been made in that state of automatism.
Yeah.
And I was saying earlier that you can see that line, the pen hasn't left the paper, and it's really difficult to do.
Yeah.
I try it a lot as an artist. I hope my hand doesn't come off the paper, I hope my hand doesn't come off the paper, and the line will get wiggly, but here you see that consistency in the lines. And the way that those abstract forms become shapes and become those symbols that you just talked about, the bird, or the breast, or the foot, or the hand, or the, yeah.
There's a lot of disembodied elements, there's a lot of disembodiedness, which I think as a woman artist, I think is quite interesting that although there are 1 or 2 images which kind of have sort of very sort of obvious femaleness to them, some of the couple of images at the back, just over Christine's head, I think those images have a very sort of vulva kind of quality to them. But I think there's a sense of, rather than being sort of a symbol of female self, I think it is much more kind of this disembodiment that kind of comes out of being a woman artist at a time when she's not necessarily getting massively taken seriously outside of this really close-knit community. So she gets the appreciation and brought over to Paris for the Paris Surrealism exhibition in 1947, but she isn't really kind of high profile enough to kind of sustain that attention and value for her work. And I think that feeds into how self-deprecating she is, as was.
It's so weird though, because if you look at the catalogue for the 1947 show, like Max Ernst is, 2 paintings down from her work in the hand. So it's,
she's got skaters.
It's a big deal, yeah, it's a big deal. But that's another thing is, again, when I was reading your thesis, is that she sort of said, oh no, she seemed to sort of be like, oh no, it's not important, and my work's not important. And Edith also sort of, apparently, when I talked to people who matters, did the same sort of thing, and sort of said, oh, it's not with researching, and it's not a big deal. And it sort of didn't have that confidence, or
it was like, oh, this old thing. Oh,
yeah.
College, that old thing. Oh, no, that's an old drawing. It doesn't seem to work about that.
No. And then they're just, some of them are just casually in the Biennale this year, so it's obviously, you wish you could ring them up and be like, did you know? So yeah, that sort of self-deprecating thing, and I don't know if that's a particular sort of to being a woman artist at that time, like sort of imposter syndrome? Or
I think one of the things that is kind of important to remember is that despite that inclusion in the 47 exhibition, in a lot of the histories of Surrealism, British Surrealism is this kind of island at the edge of kind of importance, and as an artist who isn't centrally based in London for an extensive period of time, she's in Birmingham, and Birmingham's not the centre of very many people's universes, sadly. And more, of course, obviously, because Birmingham's amazing. But it's this edge of an edge. And so I think it makes it even easier to be a bit more dismissive of the contribution and the work than it might have been for somebody like Lenny Agar, who is central London based and is travelling a lot and gets that kind of status amongst the elite. So rather than this slightly one-off experience that brings the spotlight to Bridgwater over at the Paris exhibition, a couple of paintings down from Max Ernst, there is not that same kind of attention to her that sustains through, and because she disappears off the landscape with caring for family, that just kind of cuts a whole swathe of stuff out. And I think that means that her symbolism, with it being so personal, with it having that automaticity at its heart for the starting line, despite the fact it always seems to end up in these disembodied limbs and these bird-like beaks kind of attacking you, I don't think that kind of that type of symbolism fits with the idea of symbolism in surrealist art for either the women artists or surrealism as a whole, which is much less painterly and expressive and much more kind of dreamlike clarity, the kind of sort of control.
Even though it's supposed to be automatic and not kind of...
Yeah, and but if you look at a lot of those other works, there's such a polish and control and kind of lucidity to them, which is not really what she's interested in doing. She is taking that line, she's taking those kind of marks that she's making and creating something that is much more intimate, I think. And although the images often end up very drawn in on that personal symbolism, I don't think that it looks like a lot of the other automatic drawings that are created by the surrealists in these periods at all.
Even Remington's sort of, they're supposed to be automatic, these sort of biomorphic drawings, but they're really controlled, and you can. I just don't see how you could possibly have done them in a sort of automatic.
And there isn't that same sense of kind of them working collaboratively in the way that kind of some of the exquisite corpse kind of, you drew a bit and you fold over the paper and you pass it to your peer who adds a bit more, and then eventually you unfurl it and have some very strange combined image. But they're not doing that, despite the fact that Emmy Bridgwater and Ithell Calhoun and Edith Remington are often kind of grouped together as this little trio. There's not that kind of practice within them in the way that there is between others of the male artists, particularly.
Those three women coming together. Exquisite corpses. Yeah.
No, that's not happening at all.
There is one story in one of the letters in our archives that talks about them playing heads and bodies and legs with some random soldiers that they invited over, which I love that story. I'm just like, tell me more.
Oh gosh, yes, definitely.
But I don't think that Emmy was there. But they get grouped together in this sort of the way that they're written about, those three artists, is almost as though they're practicing together and they're doing automatic drawing together in this sort of mediumship, sort of like you can imagine around a table, with their eyes closed. And I don't actually think that they spent that much time with Ithell Calhoun.
No.
I don't think that they did or really practiced together, and their work is so different as well. You can see where they've played with similar themes and things like that and been influenced by each other, but yeah, very, very different.
And I think that kind of difference comes back to, I suppose, that kind of fundamental thing that is often done with women artists, which is grouping them on the basis of their kind of gender identity, rather than thinking of them as individuals who happen to be female. And that actually for Bridgwater, the painterliness, the automaticity of the drawings it always comes back to that personal symbolism. It steps out of being part of a bigger whole for kind of surrealist practice. And I think that's why you can't imagine the three of them, or even the two of them in terms of Edith and Bridgwater, kind of sitting down together, creating across each other. Although I think you could kind of imagine them being in the same living room at the same time, kind of having a drink, and actually kind of both of them working individually with a sense of eyes closed creativity, let's get this started, but then definitely kind of moving into being more drawing back in the things that she always seems to lean into, the imagery, that the shapes always seem to end up as disembodied legs and arms and bird shapes, and particularly the beaks and the eyes, which, you know, again, if you think of the eyes being windows to the soul, kind of mirrors with the idea of the bird, but again, I think is massively subverted because the imagery is deeply uncomfortable and they're just kind of separated from everything.
Yeah, they're not pretty.
They're not pretty.
You're not like, oh yeah, I want to get into that landscape and have a nice time, have a picnic. It's like there's an exploding head and there's a bird coming out of the back of it, and yeah, it's all very, very violent. And even when you first look at it and you don't see the violence, it always seems to be there, sort of creeping around in the background. And I think you get that with Remington's work as well.
And I think that's one of the things that makes her work quite different to the other artists within the Birmingham Surrealist collection, and that there's a bit of kind of angularity to some of the work of Melville, for example. But I think because Conroy Maddox has so kind of dominated perceptions of the Birmingham Surrealists, and his works are much more kind of Magritte-esque in terms of their paintingness. I think that skews the perspective of kind of Bridgwater's work not quite fitting in and kind of being this bit out on a limb for what everybody else is doing.
Do you think they kind of did that though? Because obviously there was a split between the two groups, and there was a sort of rivalry. And everything that I've read about it sounded as though they were like, we're the weird ones. We're the cool guys. Like, we're the ones who are doing the really scandalous stuff. And all the London people are just jokers and, they're,
posers.
Yeah, I think
definitely
masquerading. We used to use the word masquerading as surrealism. But yeah, and they're just doing it to, they're changing their work to have surrealist qualities because it's what's fashionable, or they want to fit in with this idea of what surrealist should be, and that's how the Birmingham surrealists seem to define themselves or separate
in opposition to that. There's definitely an opposition to that, and I think.
Because did they refuse to do the 1936 show, or is that a rumour?
No, they didn't. No, they're kind of. The majority of the work kind of comes after that.
Right. Okay. Because I was on the gossip on that. I was like, they were like, no, we're not doing that show.
I think it's interesting because obviously that show is such a catalyst for so many people who then pick up elements of surrealism without necessarily fully committing to it. And I think that's one of the things that's quite interesting about Bridgwater, is that she's appreciated for her commitment, if you like, to a sense of pure surrealism. And I think this is why kind of Brettel particularly kind of is drawn to her work, that he sees that as being sufficiently pure to the ideals. But I'm not sure how much she is necessarily, because her work is so much more expressionistic in so many ways, and her symbolism is so personally tied that I don't think it taps into the same ideas. So I don't think she would ever have kind of fitted in with that slightly more European mainstreaming of surrealism.
I also, when I was sort of doing some swatting up, and I was just thinking about the fact that she was so productive during the war, and if that sort of limited, you know, her access to, well, or obviously had a massive influence on what it was that she decided to paint, and the size of the works as well. It's obviously very small, and if you look at the colour palette of the works in oil, it seems to be quite a condensed palette, which is used, you know, really imaginatively. But you can sort of, you know, it all becomes a sort of very tight little world that she's working in, while the outside is, you know, going up in flames.
I think that's issue of the scale of her work. I mean, I'd be interested in kind of your perspective from as an artist, as a practitioner, kind of like what the sort of scale of the work means to you in terms of how different or similar it might be to other artistic practices.
You have to imagine that she's doing this in the living room, in a small space too, so you're restricted in terms of what you can do. I know that as a child going into the living room, it was filled with stuff, with books and objects and things, so there's limited space in order to manoeuvre and to be gestural on a large scale. So certainly that, and then the fact that she's working on board, you know, these materials are limited during the war period, and she would have had limited resources because she's funding her practice herself.
Yeah.
So definitely scale, everything that's on a reduced scale.
It's that kind of funded by secretarial work.
Yeah. And you know, definitely we saw that during the COVID period when we were as restricted as artists. What do? We use the materials that we have readily available around us, and it was like watercolours and inks and, you know, the paint pots that haven't dried. So it may be that you're limited in that sense too, having access to that, being sent from wherever from the supplies. I don't know, but certainly, you know, we saw that when we were living through COVID. All of a sudden it was, okay, what can we do with what we have around us?
And the space that you are then operating in, because you can't go to anywhere else to be kind of practicing in any way. You couldn't kind of go and visit other artists' friends.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of, you know, the audiences as well. If she has moved back to Birmingham, you know, the museums wouldn't necessarily be interested in that. There wouldn't be any audience for it, so it would be very insular as a way of working too. You know, that's possibly why, as you mentioned, that there's this small group of artists working together and feeding off each other intellectually and artistically and creatively. So your practice is altered because of the circumstances and the context in which you're living and working. You know, like my husband was really working through the dictatorship in Argentina. You invent a new visual, you invent a new way of working and a new practice, a new language because of those limitations.
Yeah.
No audience, no museum, no collectors, no.
I guess in that regard, kind of, there are similarities of scale of working with people like women. So.
Oh yeah, she's little. I mean, I think the biggest is probably, can't remember the exact measurements, but
yay high.
Yeah. So yeah, all things that you can put in a folder and carry with you. Yeah. But it's weird because Rivington found that she couldn't really create anything during the war, and she found it really hard to produce work. Whereas on the flip side, Emmy seems to, I mean, probably, I don't know if inspired by it is really the right thing. It's not really the right way, but she seems to have, you know, maybe had more time to work, or had to spend more time indoors, or I wonder why they both had such different experiences in terms of their productivity during the war.
I guess that's where kind of the fact that there's quite a lot of, I mean, there are some painting works that are created obviously during that period, because she's quite active with painting during that period as well, but there are an awful lot of drawings, and obviously drawings are quite small scale. You can more easily kind of put the pen to the paper and allow that kind of line to walk around and do interesting things in a way that kind of setting up even a board to kind of paint onto and setting up and having all your paints around the clutter of your space becomes much more problematic. I mean, I think one of her paintings that was in the collection of Geoffrey Sherwin, which is Brave Morning, I think was probably the largest of her painting works, and even that is kind of, you know,
I thought it was going to be like this big, I don't know why.
Well, interestingly, the work that I wish, if I had a time machine, I could have gone back in time and bought, but obviously I was a broke student at the time, so didn't have the money, is a very small work called Lost and Found, which is...
Oh, with the person
with the peacock.
Is it an egg on it? I couldn't, because I'd never seen a photo of it before I looked at your thesis, and I was like, wow.
It's just exquisite, and I so wish that I'd been able to buy it, but it is just kind of like, you know, it's barely the size of the drawing pieces, so it is really a small image, but it is a really interesting kind of painting, given the comparison to the size of the Brave Morning piece, which is one of her other more sort of like well-known images. But yeah, so she's generally working on this sort of scale, both for drawing and at least for some of the painting works.
Was there a snobbery around that time on, you know, smaller works? If it's smaller, it's like domestic. You know, would you think there was any with, you know, with dealers and things like that? Because I do wonder about that sometimes. Whether it's like, if it's huge, then everybody wants it, and it's, you know, majestic. And
I certainly think that scale has contributed to the appreciation or lack thereof. And I think those artists who were in a more financially fortunate position were able to capitalise on that because their works were just much easier to hang alongside some of the more well-known names.
And they could travel and meet all these people and, you know, drink gin in little cafes and make friends and things like that in a way that maybe Bridgwater wasn't able to, or do you know,
she's not travelling a huge amount. I mean, as I say, she's only kind of in London more or less full time for probably a couple of years, because she ends up having to go backwards and forwards to Birmingham in terms of caring responsibilities. So that just kind of really limits the potential for what she is able to do, although it does obviously, it's interesting that it's the war period that does give her that solo show at Jack Bilbo's gallery, where you kind of like go, so she was clearly being, as you say, kind of creative enough in a way that Edith found almost impossible to do during the war period. And I think that's, I don't know the extent to which that is coming out of her having come from Birmingham and going to and from Birmingham and kind of dipping in and out of kind of working as a secretary and things. I don't know, it's really odd to kind of think why one of that kind of group is so productive during the war period, and somebody like Edith almost finds it psychologically impossible to be as creative.
I think she moved to Evesham, and I don't know what she was doing there, but she was working when she was there, and it was almost like she just didn't. It seems that, I mean, we hardly know anything about if there was a diary that came up, it would be a dream, because that would happen, you know, all the inside gossip. It was like there's hardly any letters or anything, but it seemed like she was working in Evesham and, you know, just didn't have time, perhaps, or found it difficult to get any inspiration because of the anxiety of war, in a way that maybe other artists would be fueled by that anxiety to create things like, you know, like footprints or sort of damaged and exploded landscapes.
There's certainly kind of a theme of destruction that kind of dominates the stuff around that kind of sort of 44, 45 period, where I guess information about the extent to which there was destruction across Europe with the war becomes much more well known and appreciated and understood. But I think what's so interesting is the fact that in amongst all of that kind of destruction, she still ends up kind of setting birds free. So if we think about the, oh God, my brain's gone completely, the one that's just sold in the middle, I can't remember the title, my brain's gone. Nighttime Phoenix, thank you. You know, the fact that you've got that bird kind of setting off towards its compadres, kind of in the distance, I think is really interesting. So there is a sense of kind of getting out, which is fascinating because that's the very moment at which she starts to have to be more in terms of the family issues starting to kind of kick off.
It's interesting that you get that from that painting, because I think that painting's quite scary. And it feels like a sort of sense of doom. But I guess the phoenix imagery gives it that sort of rebirth and new starts and things like that. But when I first saw that, I was like, ooh.
It's very unnerving. I think the kind of the drama mask kind of central bits are kind of really sort of, that it ties back up to that idea of sort of self-conflict or conflict within the self, because you kind of like go, well, there are sort of absences of eyes, then you've got this pair of eyes kind of on its side, at the side of the image, which I think then becomes kind of like, are you kind of in transition, are you kind of sort of skewed, is your vision experience of the world kind of tipping off its axis? It does feel kind of simultaneously as if there's an element of getting away, but not being able to get away from herself, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, the broken bodies thing comes up a lot with obvious. To me, that's just obvious reference to the war. And then you have this sort of rebirth thing in terms of, I think there's one of the drawings has got this sort of flowers coming out of holes on a torso and snakes sort of wrapping around it, and you have this sort of sense of the body sort of returning to the earth, and you know, it seems like she's sort of critiquing the way that humans interact with the earth, and you know, especially when bombs were going off and railways were being built at the time, and things were getting more industrial all the time. You can imagine that she was sort of looking at the countryside in England and thinking, oh my God, you know.
It's interesting that there's so much kind of natural, in those commas, imagery within her work, and often there is this association of women artists with nature. But I still think that kind of ties back to the leafy edgebaston kind of life that she comes from as a, you know, middle-ish class kind of privileged Edwardian daughter.
But it's still not pretty though, is it?
But it's not pretty. It wasn't pretty really even then, and certainly it's difficult to appreciate just how middle class the areas were at the time, because there's been so much kind of development around it. I mean, kind of one of her early homes is like one of literally a handful of houses that were kind of kept when the ring road streaked through. But I think her nature is always quite edgy. So although there's a sinuousness, so we were talking the other night about the sinuousness of some of the drawings that are in that first block over there by the green information section. There's a certain kind of sinuous kind of creativity to that, but a lot of the time it's much more angular, it's much more kind of cut and spiky. And I think that even comes out in the collages later on. So although there's quite a sort of green element that kind of comes through, I think it is not a settled nature. It is not a kind of pleasant.
No, it's like painful, biomorphic, sort of tearing at your skin and flowers coming out of sort of chopped up bodies, and it's all slightly,
It's interesting because obviously there's that biomorphic element to a lot of Edith Remington's work as well, and I think there is often that kind of expectation that the nature will be a bit more kind of approachable, that's not the right word, consumable, kind of enjoyable, and I think there's not a lot that's very enjoyable about the nature and the landscape and the space and the use of natural images, even with, well, especially with birds, but kind of that it's not operating like that.
No. I mean, all the bodies seem to sort of blend in with the earth around them, and then with the sky, and then, so with the nighttime phoenix, you can't sort of tell where the person starts and stops, and where the landscape starts and stops, and I think you get that with the collages, and especially the birds. The closer that you look at it, you're like, is that water, or is that land, or is that... And she's sort of obviously really interested in the ecological and the way that, how do you ever really separate things, and that sort of, one thing influences the other thing, and the death of one thing creates life for another thing, and I get that quite a lot from her work. And it's the same with the snake as well. I can't remember his name. He's my favourite.
Yes, I can remember you saying that you really like the snake.
And it looks like the sun, if it's a sun, it looks like it's almost like some plasma dripping off it that then becomes the snake, and then becomes the landscape.
The unpredictable.
And
that's from circa 42, which is interesting in terms of its timing. And certainly kind of the snake element does recur in other images.
They loved a snake.
Everybody loves
a
snake. Surrealists do like their snakes. I don't think it means what they often described as meaning. I'm aware of time, so I wanted to open things up to the floor for people to raise questions or comment on what sort of things we've said. Again, apologies that wonderful Ruth Millington isn't here. She's poorly tonight, and we wish that we got her perspective on the Birmingham Surrealist group more broadly, which I know she's done quite a bit around. But yes, let's open it up for people to raise comments and questions, and between us we will do our best to field your thoughts. Go, Christine!
I'll ask a question. Does poetry reflect on artwork or the other way around, or have they nothing to do with each other? And does the poetry systematic as well? Writing.
Yeah, her writing, I think, has a similar approach to automaticity that her automatic drawings do, in that there's clearly a sense of being able to hold a line and a thought kind of for quite a long time in terms of maintaining the thread of it on the page. But it always seems to end up attaching itself to the same sort of symbolism and imagery. So her writing, I think, it's interesting. There was a line that I kind of was rereading today. Let me just kind of scratch where it was. Where she was talking about her writing and saying that it was better when it was more free-flowing, and that actually when she was trying it never seemed to work. And let me just see if I can just find...
So Lisa, can I just ask you, when you're talking about that, that's because you've spoken to her about it and asked her?
Yes, yeah. And also I was lucky enough to be able to draw on some interviews that a woman called Christine Svensson had done with Emmy as well, around the same time. That gutting experience, particularly because although I was a mature student, I was an undergraduate student. You know, I've got this kind of relatively obscure artist that I can write about, and then go and talk to Conroy, who says, "Oh, well, you should be in contact with Christine. She's doing an MA dissertation on her." But it was definitely an interesting line. Let me just see if I can pick up where the
had a massive mind blank, but what's that way of writing? It's not called chain of thought. What's it called? Where you just keep writing?
Stream of consciousness.
Stream of consciousness. I went down a loophole with this. So I was like, stream of consciousness and automatism, they've got to be quite similar, but apparently they're not at all. That's totally wrong. Just throwing phrases and words around because I don't know what I'm talking about. But the stream of consciousness thing is you're thinking about it, but you're just letting it flow.
Yes.
Whereas the automatism is supposed to be more, you're not thinking about it, you just sort of go into yourself. Whereas I get the feeling that her poems seem more stream of consciousness, whereas those seem more automatic.
There is a difference. The line that she said, the ones I write automatically are better than the others. The ones that I think out seem very false, stupid really. But I think, as I kind of go on to say here, it kind of ignores the possibility that you're using automatism or stream of consciousness as a kind of spark of inspiration that you can then exploit to use your own symbolism and draw that out and see how the shapes kind of echo things.
And that's what she does with the decalcomania.
Yeah.
And then she sort of gets a paintbrush and sort of trails sort of sinuous bits out of them and reworks into them. But yeah, it's similar sort of way of sort of painting version.
Yeah, I mean, her writing, I think, it's probably even more obscure than her artworks in many respects, although obviously kind of in terms of the birds, for example, it's kind of a substantive piece. It is. It's effectively a sort of short story, and that is kind of quite a substantive piece of writing to kind of have in a, one of the main sort of art journal publications that come out of Surrealism at that time. And there's certainly a lot of echoes of the same symbolism. So, obviously it's talking about the birds, and I do like the way that kind of story ends. The birds who have been sitting on the chorus as part of the decoration flew down into the court and circled about the heads of the king and courtiers, fluttering as close as possible. All the people flapped their hands helplessly. Suddenly the little girl, another one of her key images, pointed at the king. "You must get out of here," she said in a grown-up voice. "This is their palace." So there's a sense of kind of sort of the birds having ownership.
Yeah, the land of birds.
And that's why I kind of think it's quite a nice tie-up to particularly that collage, which comes, so much later in her career, but obviously is tapping into that same sense of that aspect of my conflicted self is much more in charge than we might have thought. Does that kind of answer your question, Christy?
Yes. Could you talk a bit more about the collages and what significance you would attach to them in her wider body of work?
I think it ties up with what you were saying about kind of artists trying to work through COVID and artists trying to create in living room type spaces with all your personal clutter around them. She picks up collage as a much more practical kind of creative outlet at a moment where her living circumstances are much more constrained. So although she's freed of a lot of the burdens of care, she's by this point kind of getting on in years, and therefore kind of you work with what's available to you. And there's something about kind of creation of these collages that is tapping into what is possible for her in those lived circumstances, while still being kind of drawn to the same kind of images and symbolism that she's always kind of used. So there was another...
And I might attach it actually to the access to this media, the media of magazines at the time. Maybe thinking as she's being radical as an artist in the 40s.
Yeah.
She's also saying, this is a fantastic medium for me to work with now. Look, I've got access to these magazines, and I know that our family were big subscribers of magazines. There would be tons of them. So it's like very automatic. You pick up a magazine, you rip out the symbol that has always been constant in work, and then apply it to this surface very quickly. So it's an activity that you can do.
Yes.
Because it's of that time.
Yeah. Do you remember her? Because she worked.
I don't remember her working. No, that was my grandmother.
Yeah.
I knew she was a famous artist, or a very special famous artist.
Yes.
And,
I don't know if you've had a chance to explain your connection to
Emmy Bridgwater is my great aunt, so my grandmother is Catherine, but it's my father's stepmother. So there's not a bloodline, but she's been a very important figure for our family throughout our life, from a young age. And we knew we had an important artist in our family, or I knew I had an important artist, probably more so than my brother, because I became an artist myself. But it was certainly somebody to be revered, and it meant that there was a possibility that it become a profession, which was even slightly unheard of, even in my years, my early years.
No, when I came to see you and I met you for the first time, you had the archives and everything was so carefully wrapped. Like, I was making sure it was like Christmas, but it was, everything was so beautifully wrapped. You could tell that it was something special when you walked in, because you never know what you're going to find when people say they have an archive.
Exactly, and I didn't know it until my father transferred it to me.
That's
very
exciting.
I think archives can vary between the kind of literal bag of stuff, carry a bag of stuff, to kind of pristinely preserved materials. And I just kind of picked out from the photographs that I'd taken over at Jonathan Blong's.
That's where they're from.
Yeah, that's where they're from the exhibition at Jonathan Blong's.
What's that, a collage?
Yeah, and that's a collage piece, which is very odd, with kind of like this
Bikini.
dog's head and kind of bikini type thing with.
It's like vulgar.
Yeah, it is. Given that, this is from 1975. She's born in. She's born in 1906. This is an interesting kind of work to kind of be.
It is now. I wonder who's got it. It's hanging on someone's sort of wall, and
I'd be interested to know where it has ended up.
I'd love to know. I love that one.
And I think that's quite a few of the works that I would kind of like to know where they actually have ended up.
I was curious to know, is there much in the archive about the show she had with Jack Bilber? Because I worked with Jack Bilber's estate, and so we did do a show about Bilber's modern art gallery, but I was just interested, is there much? Bilber used to correspond with people, and he always wrote lovely letters to artists when he sold something. It was all during the war years. He would then always send them a letter, and it was the kind of brother, so I wondered if there's much correspondence with him.
I don't know. We went through the archive together. Tor was the first to come and visit.
That would have been very specific around the time of the show. Yeah.
We were specifically looking at the relationship between artist friends and not necessarily dealers, as she may have been working with. So
he'd have called himself an artist too.
Definitely.
But there's so much. There's so many treasures in there, isn't there? And
lots of
read
letters.
through.
Lots.
Yeah. So.
We may uncover that.
Is that 1942?
42.
I've got the invitation card.
Oh, how lovely.
Really?
It's in the Bilber archive, And I live with a painting. It's interesting seeing this, because I live with a painting of her, it's a woman at the University Support Tutor in a birdcage.
Really?
So it's a sort of bird. So it's the idea of her identifying with the bird.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Sounds amazing.
That's interesting.
She does have a bird obsession. I think everyone who you just look at her work quickly and straight away the bird themes come out in some way, even if they're sort of speckled or hidden in the background. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Hi. I think we probably need to round things up.
Any more questions?
Unless there's any more questions from anybody, I'm hanging around if I don't break my phone first. Hanging around for a bit, so please feel free to kind of come and talk to us, and if you want to have a look at the tome, you're completely welcome to. But otherwise, thank you very much to Lucy, and thank you very much to Tor, and thank you in absence to Ruth, whose spirit is here with us. Thank you to Christine and the gallery for inviting us here this evening, and I hope that's been an enjoyable event for you.
Thank you.